registering.
You don't have to be the Swiss train, right?
Huh?
You don't have to be a Swiss train. You have to be exactly on time.
Coming from the national category of professionals to make it easier of Italy. So he will be one of the speakers in the.
Hi, I'm
Matt
Matt
Hopkins,
Hopkins.
University of Leicester, Joris Verda, and Labour. Representative of the professionals categories, accountants
Nice to meet you.
and tax experts, tax advisors. Hi,
Edward Clemens from Amsterdam.
Doesn't seem to work. Hello? No?
I don't think the mics are on at all. But this one's on.
The other should work, otherwise we need to.
You're the only one.
Seems to be the only one.
Okay, can you do all the presentation?
Absolutely.
I'll do the slides. You just keep talking.
I can talk. It might not always be correct.
That's fine. We'll just nod or shake.
Yeah.
But at least we have one mic.
Yeah, so we can always try that.
Misschien kan er maar één per keer.
Ja, dat is wel.
Brava.
Ah, così è da
Sì,
schiacciare.
sì, vedi, on, off.
Schiacciato, al contrario di quanto. Grazie.
So they're all on.
Dear all, welcome everybody. Please have a seat. Welcome everybody to the conference Assessing the Risk of Money Laundering in Europe, Research and Practical Implication. My name is Michele Riccardi and I'm a senior researcher in Transcrime, the Joint Research Center of Transnational Crime of the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore. And today I'm here as a project manager of the EU-funded project IARM, whose main preliminary findings will be presented today. But besides presenting the project, today wants to be an occasion to foster a high-level debate on the issue of money laundering risk assessment. And it's not easy to have about 60 people in such a foggy and cold morning of December to join at the university to speak about risk assessment. So I am very glad to see you here. There are people from the academia, people from the public sector, from banks, professionals, and it's not easy to have all these categories represented in one event. So I think that this is somehow already a success. Before starting, let me do two things. So the first is also to bring the regards of Professor Ernesto Savona, who is the director of Transcrime, who unfortunately cannot be here today because he was invited by the government of Peru, Latin America, for a high-level initiative on organized crime. Those of you who know Ernesto know that he was speaking about risk assessment more than 30 years ago. So even before the FATF started talking about risk assessment, and I would say even before the FATF was established. So it's a pity that he cannot be here because he could really provide a big contribution to the discussion. And secondly, let me thank the Università Cattolica for hosting the event and the Transcrime staff for the organization, and in particular Riccardo Milani and Alessio Fontana. Today the agenda will be structured as follows. As you can see, the first part of the morning will be devoted to the presentation of the results of the project. Then we will have a part for question and answers, a coffee break. Then we will have a roundtable involving a representative from the public sector at national and international level, which will continue this afternoon with some presentation. And finally, we will have a roundtable with representatives from the private sector, so obliged entities, banks, professionals, and also data providers. I hope that we could have a lively discussion about this topic. There is an interpretation service, so if you want, you can get headphones just at the bottom of the room. So if you have not done, please do that. Interpretation service will be provided in Italian and English. So let's go to the project. Let me open the presentation. So, Project IARM, what is Project IARM? Project IARM is a research project funded by the European Commission, DG Home Affairs. It started February 2015 and will end February 2017, so 2 years' time. The final report will be available in February, so today we will not present the final report, but some preliminary findings. Obviously, all the details regarding the analysis, regarding the results, will be available in the final report. Several partners have been involved in the project. I mentioned Transcrime of the Università Cattolica as coordinator, and we had 2 other universities, namely the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands and the University of Leicester in the UK. Besides these 3 research partners, we had some role of associate institutional partners from Ministry of Economy and Finance, Dipartimento del Tesoro in Italy, and the Bank of Italy UIF, so the Financial Intelligence Unit, which provided external institutional support. The Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Security of Justice in the Netherlands, and the National Police Chiefs Council in the UK. Also, Home Office in the UK provided support at the early stage of the process. I would like to thank all these institutional partners for the feedback, for the data provided, for the suggestion, and we will have the luck to have them here today also participating in the discussion. As you can see from the partnership, the project focuses on 3 countries, Italy, the Netherlands, and the UK. Where does the project stems for? Well, you know, most of you should know that the risk-based approach has become the pivot of the whole anti-money laundering regime at international level. Not by chance, it is the first recommendation of the well-known FATF recommendation, which states that countries should identify, assess, and understand the money laundering, terrorist financing risk they face. On the basis of this, all the measures against money laundering should be commensurate, and this is exactly the concept of risk-based approach, which applies at national level, so national institutional measures, but also at private sector level. So obliged entities should commensurate their measures, including customer due diligence, to the risk of money laundering of their clients. And in this line, in the latest years, a number of risk assessment exercises have been produced, both at national level and also at supranational level. The European Commission is conducting this European supranational risk assessment led by DG Justice. At lower level, also guidelines and the normal indicators have been produced, like for banks, for professionals, and for categories of obliged entities. But despite this production abundance of risk assessment models, we think and we thought there were some gaps. So first, lack of harmonized methodologies for risk assessment. And second, lack of operational tools. We have various national and at various level risk assessment exercise, but then the tools at the disposal of obliged entities and of the other stakeholders involved in the project are not easy to be implemented and to be used in the operational side. This is exactly the gap that we wanted to address with the project IARM. What are the objectives of the project? First, to develop a standardized methodology for money laundering risk assessment, which could be transparent, which could be stress the quantitative approach, which could be used and extended to other domains with respect to the 3 countries where we tested. This methodology implies the development of a composite indicator of money laundering risk, and we developed at 2 levels. So at regional level, so a composite indicator which could allow to measure the risk across regions within one country. So across provinces in Italy, across policy areas in the UK, and also at business sector level. So the risk of money laundering across all business sectors, not just the regulated sectors, so not just obliged entities. And the composite indicator, who could be then quite easy to be implemented, to be used by obliged entities as well. We tested this methodology in 3 member states, which are exactly the three covered countries I mentioned before, so Italy, Netherlands, and the UK. The starting point of all this exercise is the FATF definition of money laundering risk. If you take the 2013 FATF guidelines on risk assessment, it states clearly that money laundering risk is a function of 3 issues: threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences. And this is nothing more than the, let's say, usual, traditional concept of risk in any field. If we look at the risk of earthquake, it is the product between the probability that an earthquake could occur times the impact that the earthquake could generate. If we think about credit risk, is the probability of a default times the impact of the default on the economy, on the society, on businesses. And the same as money laundering. The probability that a money laundering event could occur times the impact, the consequences that this could generate. But if measuring threats and vulnerabilities is hard, to measure consequences is even harder. And so we, ourselves, is the same than in other national risk assessment exercise, decided to focus only on threats and vulnerabilities. And so our assessment, our analysis of the money laundering risk basically focused on only threats and vulnerabilities. This seems to be a quite theoretical debate, so let's go into the empirical analysis. And so we will have now 3 presentations, one on Italy with myself. I'm sorry to repeat myself, but I hope there will be intervention. Then we will have the analysis of the risk in the Netherlands at business sector level by Professor Fareeda and Professor Clemens. And then the analysis at UK level with Professor Hopkins from University of Leicester. So let's start with Italy. We are hosting the conference, so let's start from this country. And I'm glad to do this because, you know, it seems everything prepared and organized, but in the last 2 days we had 2 very big anti-money laundering operations in Italy. And we have been interviewed and called by several media about this, and not by chance we are talking about money laundering risk today. The approach that we adopted can be summarized in 7 steps. First, identifying risk factors, so identifying the threats and the vulnerabilities. The second is to transforming this concept into something measurable, so to find appropriate proxy variables to measure threats and vulnerabilities. We collect the data, we analyze the data, we adopted a specific statistical technique to identify within the data components, the main components of the money laundering risk, and then we combine these components exactly to produce one composite indicator, which was then validated through a sensitivity analysis and further test. So the first step of this exercise is to identify the risk factors. And we did that at both provincial level and business sector level. Today I will focus only on the analysis at territory level. What are the risk factors across Italian provinces? Well, they have been somehow identified looking at various sources. First, the academic literature. Second, reports by the Bank of Italy, FIU, reports by the Ministry of Economy and Finance, the latest national risk assessment, so valutazione nazionale del rischio riciclaggio, judiciary evidence and reports from law enforcement. And we identify the following risk factors. The assumption is the following. These are the risk factors. I will comment all of them right now. The assumption is the following, that the level of money laundering risk in a certain province is higher as is a function of the level of each of these risk factors. The higher is the level of organized crime in a province, the higher is the level of money laundering risk, the higher is the cash intensity in that province, the higher is the risk of money laundering in that area. So we can see here organized crime, illicit markets, and tax evasion as the main, let's say, predicate offenses contributing to the money laundering risk. What is missing here is, first of all, corruption, which we know and has been identified by the FATF as a main risk factor, as a main threat in Italy. We did not include it because it is difficult to measure, especially at sub-national level. And I immediately tell a weakness of this approach, that it works well where we have good data. If we do not have good data, then it does not work very well. So it's somehow a function of the quality of the data that we are able to collect, that we are able to elaborate. And I think that the data issue is one of the issues of today. And I think it will be stressed also in next round tables. As regards the vulnerabilities, I focus on 2 of them. The first is the cash intensiveness. So it was stressed by the FATF, it was stressed by the National Risk Assessment that the level of cash does constitute the main vulnerability of, in terms of money laundering in the country. It is quite a strange thing. Italy is the 2nd country in Europe in terms of number of point of sale, POS, per capita, after Luxembourg. But despite this, is one of the countries in Europe with the highest intensiveness and use of cash. A second important vulnerability is the opacity of the business ownership, and we will soon talk about this. Each of these risk factors have been, as said, operationalized into proxy variables. And for each of them, we identify a number of proxy variables. So like organized crime was measured through mafia homicides, the number of mafia association, number of city council dissolved due to mafia infiltration, confiscated assets. cash was measured through the so-called cash ratio, which is an indirect measure which was developed by the Bank of Italy in past years, and which allow to, let's say, have an indirect feeling of how much cash is used as a means of payment by individuals. One of the most difficult risk factors to operationalize and measure is the opacity of business ownership. Everybody stressed the fact that the more complex is the ownership structure of the business, the highest is the risk. But then how to measure this complexity? And this was done thanks to some data that we had the luck to collect and have for this analysis, which was provided by Bureau van Dijk, which is a data provider, leading data provider, which provides data on company all across Europe. And one of the data that was provided was data about shareholders and beneficial owners of Italian companies. So this allowed us to do the first large-scale investigation of business ownership. And I think that this is one of the probably most added value of this project. We were able to, for the first time, to really analyze what is the ownership of Italian companies, of Dutch companies, of UK companies. In Italy, we did the analysis on a sample of 3.7 million companies, which it is about 5 million of shareholders and beneficial owners. For example, we were able to see how many are the foreign shareholders in Italy of Italian companies. And apparently it's only 1.7% of the total number of shareholders. And the number of beneficial owners is even less, is even lower. We are talking about 1.3% are foreign. All the other are Italian, according to the data. What are the most represented nationalities? Switzerland is the first in terms of shareholders. More than 11% of foreign shareholders are Swiss. While in terms of beneficial owner, it's quite an interesting and surprising data, which we are discussing also on how to interpret. Seems that Spanish individuals and companies are among the most represented beneficial owners. Not all of them are individuals. The percentage of a legal person much varies depending on the nationality. For example, almost 100% of the shareholders from Luxembourg and the Netherlands are a legal person. While in terms of Chinese or Romanian, most of them, the majority, is represented by individuals. And this obviously poses implication when we are talking about customer due diligence and beneficial ownership identification. The second thing that we were able to do was to measure the so-called beneficial ownership distance. So this is a data provided by Bureau van Dijk, and it measures the number of steps which separate a company from its beneficial owner. This data is done as follows. If the beneficial ownership distance is equals to 1, it means that we have a direct control. Well, in Italy, the average distance is 1.2, which means a very direct control. And this is interesting, especially if compared to the other countries. In the UK is about 1.6, if I remember well. 1.5. 1.5, so yeah, lowering it a little bit. But apparently in some areas it's much, much higher. In Italy as well, the beneficial ownership distance changes depending on the sector and on the areas. So in border provinces like Imperia is 1.5, like Bolzano and Catanzaro, Savona. So this really changes the complexity of the ownership structure of registered businesses depending on where you go. And also depending on the sector. A sector where we have a high number of multinational companies like electricity or pharmaceuticals have a quite higher beneficial ownership distance, but also sectors like gambling, which was involved in one of the two big investigations in the last few days. The data have been collected, have been analyzed. This is the correlation. I will not comment all this correlation matrix because it would be impossible. Just a baseline message. We found a strong correlation between organized crime, proxies, tax evasion, underground economy, and cash. Nothing new, but somehow this is a confirmation of a feeling that we had. So there is a beneficial and mutual relationship between all the organized crime, the underground economy, and the intensiveness in the use of cash. One of the techniques that we use to identify the principal component, the main components of the money laundering risk, was the so-called principal component analysis. Again, I will skip the most technical bits. We are obviously available to answer any question in this regard, and you will find all the details in the final report. This technique allows you to see how all these variables group around specific drivers, specific components of risk, and it identified in Italy 5 main components of money laundering risk. And for each of these components, we produced a map. So the first component is the mafia infiltration and presence. We see that not as expected, the highest level, so the darker areas are in the south, but we have not, you know, a picture which says just we have south and north of Italy. We have differences within the south and difference within the north. The second component was what we labeled cash-based and underground economy. The third is the one regarding illicit markets, where Campania really comes out. We have high levels of illicit markets in that region when we are talking about counterfeiting, when we are talking about drug trafficking, when we are talking about illicit trafficking of tobacco products, for example. The fourth, opacity of business ownership. This is more interesting. The map is more fragmented. We have provinces in the north where the level is quite high. And the final is what is really related to money remittances. This was stressed by even the National Risk Assessment and by previous studies by the FIU as a real risk factor in Italy, and it appears as a sort of isolated component also in our analysis. Having all these maps, we adopted and followed what we, with a joke, we call within our office as the Lasagna Approach. What does it mean? That we take all these layers, all these maps, and we put all one on the other in order to obtain a single composite indicator of risk. And this is the map. So the darker areas are those with the highest level of money laundering risk, according to our analysis. And this is the first 12 ranking provinces. The first four top are 4 Calabria provinces from Calabria, but we have also some provinces in the north, namely Imperia and Prato are ranking also high. So these are highlighted in the map. So we can see that basically is the northern Campania, so Naples, Caserta, and southern Lazio provinces, Latina first of all. We have southern Calabria, while Cosenza has lower values. We have western Sicily. Then in the middle, you can see very tiny the province of Prato and the province of Imperia, and finally some province also between Lombardy and Piedmont, also on the border, which according to our analysis ranked quite high. This approach is quite useful because it allows to identify for each province, for each area in Italy, the factor which most contributes to the risk of money laundering. So in this plot, we can, for example, identify the provinces which have lower organized crime measures but higher cash. So like some Sardinia provinces fall in that category. On the top right-hand quadrant, we have provinces which instead have both high organized crime and high cash, while on the lower right-hand quadrant we have provinces with lower cash intensity but high organized crime measures. So this is, I think, very useful from a policy perspective because it allows to identify for each province the factor which most contribute to the risk. So it allows policymakers and regulators to intervene exactly where we have the highest contributing factor. And another useful thing is to compare our map of risk with the map of suspicious transaction reports. So segnalazioni operazioni sospette, SOS. We can see here that they are quite similar in a way, and also they are very correlated. This STR with the money laundering risk can be compared in this way or in this way. This chart shows how is the relationship across all the 110 Italian provinces in terms of STR issued and in terms of money laundering risk as we estimated it. And the provinces which are over the red line are those which, according to the estimated level of risk, seem to issue more STR than expected, while those below the line are those which seem to issue less than STR than expected. And I think this as well could be useful for policymakers, regulators, monitoring agency to better have a vision, have a supervision of the what is happening in terms of behavior of issuing STR. Just to conclude, this is only a first step, so it's an exploratory and innovative methodology for which also I would like to thank the Transcrime staff and especially Riccardo Milani and Diana Camerini in the first stage of the project. I think that it does not aim to substitute the national risk assessment, but only to complement it. So it could be useful for having a better understanding of the overall risk, and it responds to the new regulation. If you are looking to the proposed changes to the 231, so to the 231/2007, so the anti-money laundering regulatory references in Italy, we see that it is asked explicitly to produce objective and solid methodologies to perform risk assessment. So it could be used by a variety of beneficiaries. I mentioned it, anti-money laundering regulators, policymakers, FIU and law enforcement to identify the most anomalous areas or factors, supervisory authorities, but also obliged entities. I think that these indicators could be quite useful tools, useful instruments in their hands to respond to customer due diligence obligation. How to improve? I think that this could be somehow extended to all the countries where we did the analysis. More and better data is needed. If we have better data, we could do better analysis. And also the quantitative approach should be complemented by a qualitative perspective. This is not enough. It works well where we have good data, but by definition, emerging money laundering trends do not have good data, but needs to be identified, and this could be done with a qualitative approach. So just to conclude, we did the same approach also on identify the highest risk in terms of business sector. I will not comment it, but we may provide some indications and information during the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Joris Fareeda from the Free University of Amsterdam, and together with Edward Clemens, we did in this project a similar approach, but applied to the Netherlands and applied to economic sectors. The Netherlands is a bit of a smaller country than Italy, where a regional analysis might be less interesting, less relevant. So what we do is we focus on 83 relevant economic sectors at the division level of the NASA classification, the international classification on how to classify all the different economic activities in a certain country, where our main question is, where do we see the highest money laundering risk? If we consider that there is a money laundering risk in a certain country, in which sectors would it be most likely to find those? So what we do is try to find the relative risk compared to all the other economic sectors and find out where it is with a similar methodology as been presented by Professor Michele Riccardi for Italy. We see this policy relevance really in terms of focus of anti-money laundering and also other measures to fight this money laundering risk. Other measures in the Netherlands, I will talk a bit more about it, can also be administrative law measures trying to prevent infiltration of organized crime investments in the different sectors. We're also trying with this methodology to find out where this risk really comes from. So could we also explain why a certain sector comes out very risky in our analysis? Because this could also for policymakers be very relevant in targeting a certain or very specific type of policies against these money laundering risks. And we hope that this approach, a very quantitative approach, can complement often more qualitative focused risk assessment that still has to be done in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, the first money laundering national risk assessment will come out next year, hopefully. I saw a timeline of May. I hope we will have the report by then. What we have so far is a pilot study, a survey of all the methods and data that can be used for national risk assessment, which has been written, well, also by me, so I'm also repeating myself, I guess, together with Henk van der Veen of the Scientific Research and Documentation Center of the Ministry of Security and Justice in the Netherlands. I think this is just to give an overview of what kind of methods we could really use in the Netherlands to do a specific national risk assessment. I think it's a very interesting report for those of you that are interested in this area and that are willing to learn an extra language, because this report is still in Dutch, so you will have to have a boost in your linguistic knowledge, I guess. We have a summary in English, so that might be easier to read. But you see, this is really more, it has been a public document, but it is really used for the internal process of developing this national risk assessment. And I hope that this research comes in time to also complement what we are doing in the Netherlands. We don't have the national risk assessment yet, but maybe this can be a first peek of what could come out of such a risk assessment. In terms of the methodology that we follow to come to risk levels for different sectors in the Netherlands, we more or less follow the methodology that Michele already explained to you. So I'm going to explain to you a bit about which kind of threats and vulnerabilities we identified for the Netherlands and which data we collected as the proxy variables for this. I'll give a small peek into what these kind of data could show us and what comes out of a principal component analysis. And as a validation, we also tried to not use the principal component analysis, but use a very theoretical approach and see whether the results that we find really come from maybe less transparent or more statistical technique, or whether a more theoretical approach would give similar results. So this is more or less a validation of the results and how robust the results are. So also in the Netherlands we don't focus so much on the consequences, but we focus on the threats and vulnerabilities, which we try to identify and for which we had to gather the data. If you focus this kind of methodology on sectors, on economic sectors, what you don't have is the crime statistics, because crime happens in a certain region and in a certain point in time, but it doesn't happen in an economic sector. The economic sector can be involved later because of infiltration, because of investments, but not at the first stage, not at the crime level itself. So we had to work hard to find relevant threat variables that we can use in our methodology. Eventually, I'm quite proud of the 4 that we did find to be used in this methodology. We have the organized crime investments from a monitor that we do in the Netherlands, the organized crime monitor, which has been going on for years in the Netherlands, which I think is quite unique. And in this monitor, there is a study on at the moment 150 organized crime cases in the Netherlands. And of these organized crime cases, we know a lot of information. There's been done a lot of in-depth research on this. And among the factors that we know is also whether this money has been invested in the legal sector and in which specific sector. So we have data on where the money goes in these organized crime cases. Similar type of data is retrieved from an EU project also chaired by Michele Riccardi and also done by me for the Netherlands, which is called Organized Crime Portfolio. In this research we looked at all the public sources that we could find of cases of organized crime and tried to classify them. And in this research we also classified them into where these organized crime investments were done, in which sectors they were done. So these are quite similar kind of threat variables. Then we have in the Netherlands a very, I think, unique system of trying to prevent organized crime investments with an administrative law procedure. The idea here is that if you want to open, to get a license for instance, if you want to open a bar in a certain city, it could be that the city requests to investigate whether this opening a bar, if the source of the money that is being used to open the bar might be related to organized crime. So whether the person itself does it or whether the source of the money that is being used, whether this comes from organized crime. So a city could file a request to a certain bureau who's then investigating to what extent there are investments related to organized crime. We have data on the number of requests. We don't know the result of the request. So we don't know whether the result of the investigation was whether it is related to organized crime or not. We only have the number of requests and we hope that this proxies the probability of having organized crime investments. Another completely different type of data is data from the tax office on how often when a tax officer does an investigation in a certain company, in a certain sector, how often he finds something that is wrong, whether the tax declaration had to be corrected, which could be in favor of the person that is being corrected or to the disadvantage of this person if he's trying to evade or avoid taxes. And so these corrections, we know how often they happen in each sector, which could give an indication of cooking the books, how often companies are trying to change some of their statistics, some of their reporting, financial reporting, maybe for money laundering purposes. So we hope that this will proxy it. On the vulnerability side, we have, just as in Italy, we have some statistics on profitability, where the idea is that the more profitable sectors might be more sensitive to organized crime investments, because first of all you have bigger profits, which means that more white profits can be generated, and it also could be that less regulated sectors and upcoming sectors are more profitable and more interesting for criminals. We have the cash intensity. Certain very cash-intensive businesses could be more vulnerable to money laundering, has been described quite extensively in the literature. And we have three variables which are related to the opacity that Michele has been talking about, where we look at the distance, this BO distance, so the distance between the company and the beneficial owner, as explained. We also have a secrecy score of the owners, which basically means that if we have foreign owners, do these owners come from countries that have a high secrecy score? So is it easy or not to identify these owners? And we have the same for shareholders. These kind of statistics are corrected for average company size. And to show you why we do this, I'll give you some insight in this first variable, which is the BO distance. So in the Netherlands you could see on the section level, so this is a bit more aggregated level, because with 87 sectors you would not be able to see it in the back of the room. So here we have on the section level what the average distance of the beneficial owner to the company is. So as you can see in agriculture, there's almost only direct ownership. Almost all of the people directly own their company, which could be a farm, and then it's just the farmer that owns his own company. But you can see that in certain sectors, the distance between the beneficial owner and the actual company that is operating in the Netherlands can be quite big. And the top three here are mining, energy, and finance. So these three sectors apparently have a larger distance between the beneficial owner and the actual company. But if we look at the average size of companies within the sector, we again see the same top three. So we see again mining. The mining companies are on average the biggest companies in the Netherlands, and energy sector and the finance sector. There we see a very big company. As soon as you have a very big company, a more complex company with maybe offices in different countries, it might be more necessary to have a larger corporate structure and a more complex corporate structure. So it might be also more logical that the distance between the beneficial owner, the eventual beneficial owner, and the actual company is bigger. So if we consider that the distance is very big, but this could be related to the fact that the company is so big, what we can do is correct the beneficial owner distance with the size of the company, and then we see completely different sectors. So these are the statistics when we correct for the average size of the company. And then you see mining, energy, and finance are not so surprising anymore. The disadvantage is that the actual values don't mean anything anymore because you correct it. But what we see is that three completely different sectors pop up. So first of all, the entertainment sector, which also includes gambling, so it might be related to the former results that have been presented. Other services, which in the Netherlands includes prostitution, because it's legal, and this is being classified under other services. And we have hotels and bars, which have often been mentioned in the literature as attractive for organized crime investments, also because they're so close to the criminals themselves. So this to give you a feeling of why we do a weighted statistics instead of taking the actual statistics. So we have all these different indicators for money laundering risk. We have all these proxies that we identified, and these 9 are used in this principal component analysis. We throw them into the statistical analysis, and what comes out is that with only 4 components, we could explain 67% of the underlying variation. The variation of the underlying phenomenon that we try to measure, which is money laundering risk. I try to label these different components a bit to make a bit of sense of all these numbers, for those of you that are not so statistically focused. So the first principal component seems to be focused on organized crime infiltration and secrecy of the beneficial owner. The second is a combination of cash-intensive businesses where the secrecy is also quite high, so we see complex ownership structures. There is opacity. It's quite hard to find out who the actual owner or shareholder is. And then we have 2 principal components that are very related to these corrections in the tax declarations, which we call cooking the books. Of course, we cannot prove that this is cooking the books. It's just a correction of a tax officer. But this is what we're trying to proxy. And we see here 2 components, one combined with high profits and one combined with secrecy among their shareholders. So with these 4 principal components, we're gonna calculate what the money laundering risk is in the different sectors in the Netherlands. So here I have the results for the top 10 and the bottom 10 to give you a feeling of what comes out. So the sector that is most risky in terms of this analysis in the Netherlands is accommodation, which is basically the hotel sector. So this apparently turns out to be the highest sector. There have been some research also into this in the Netherlands, into whether criminals are investing in hotels. The second is the security and investigation activities. We have some reports on that motorcycle gangs are operating in this sector and are providing their services as a security on the side. The third sector might look a bit surprising, which is sewerage. But if you consider that this is basically construction, it might be more familiar to money laundering risks. Also in Canada, quite recently, there's been some research into this sector and whether public tenders there might be related to collusion. And well, there is the whole list. So we have the bars, and in there we have the art sector, which has also been mentioned sometimes in the literature. And in the bottom we see all kinds of other very different sectors. And I would say that although you cannot really see it in the bottom 10, a lot of the manufacturing sectors have a very low score, just above the bottom 10, but still a very low score. So these seem to be have much less money laundering risk in the Netherlands. And so to give a bit of a validation of this approach, of this method, we said, what if we don't use the principal component analysis at all and just think of these different risk factors as all being equal? So let's say they all have the equal weight, and we just try to find out which of these sectors then comes out. If we just rank them, all these different, we normalize all the variables, and then just add them up and see which sectors comes out is a score from 0 to 100. And let's compare this result with the results we already have. So what we see here is on the left-hand side, the principal component analysis, the results from the principal component analysis as I showed you earlier. And on the right-hand side, you see what if we just add up all the variables, the normalized values of them, and score them from 0 to 100, which sectors come out. And as you can see, in both cases, the hotel sector comes out first, which seems to have the highest money laundering risk. And below you see that although they change the order a bit, you see quite similar sectors again in the top 10. So even if we don't use the principal component analysis, even if you might have a bit less trust in these kind of statistical methods, if we just add up the variables, we also come to quite similar results. Actually, if we calculate the correlation is very high. The correlation of 93% means that it's very similar results and that it's almost identical. And that's, I think, what you can also see if you look just at the sectors that have been shown. So we see this as quite a robust result that even if you don't use the principal component analysis, you can still find these similar sectors, which might mean that these are indeed the sectors with more money laundering risk. So, well, we see that this is a very pilot study, so I won't expect that directly in May the next national risk assessment will include this whole analysis. But I think that eventually we hope that this kind of method, this procedure, can complement the national risk assessments that need to be done in Europe and all around the world, actually. We think the results so far seem to be very robust in terms of the estimation method. We can also leave out the estimation method and still find very similar results. And what we see is that the risky sectors in the Netherlands for money laundering seem to be the hotels, the security sector, sewerage, retail and art. And much less risky, or at least risky, seems to be the manufacturing sectors. So these have been the results that we found in IARM for this, for the Netherlands in this research. Thank you.
Thank you, Joris. So we now move to the last of the three countries, so UK. Yeah, where we had again an analysis at area level. So please, Professor Matt Hopkins from University of Leicester.
Hello, everybody. First and foremost, I would like to say thank you to Mikkel for promoting me. I'm actually an associate professor and not a professor, so thank you, Mikkel. A little bit premature there. Thank you very much. So last but not least, the UK. I'm not quite sure if this is a function of Brexit or not, that we come last. Sorry. I am going to talk through some of the preliminary results from the United Kingdom. My presentation is in three sections. First, I'm going to give a brief introduction. I'd like to talk a little bit about the UK context, because we have had a national risk assessment, which in some ways I think was really very good. It was a very good step forward in terms of understanding this issue. In other ways, I think it wasn't so good. Then I'd like to talk about the application of the risk-based approach. And what I'm presenting today is an area-based model based on police areas in England and Wales rather than the whole of the UK. So I'm not presenting a business model. We found that developing a business model was not possible at all in the UK because the threats data in relation to businesses just don't exist in the UK. There are various measures of commercial victimisation in the UK, and there's a very good commercial victimisation survey, but there aren't measures of threats across all business sectors in relation to predicate offences for money laundering. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk around some practical and theoretical lessons from the research so far. So I'm going to say a little bit about the UK context. We did have a national risk assessment which was published in 2015, and the national risk assessment in the UK covered the UK regulated business sectors. So these were businesses such as banks, high value dealers, trust and service providers, accountancy service businesses. So there was really quite a limited focus there on what was covered in terms of companies, so just the focus on the regulated sectors. One thing the National Risk Assessment did do was to identify a number of predicate offences which are linked to money laundering, or offences which, I suppose in layman's terms, generate dirty cash. So it looked at fraud offences, tax offences, drugs, modern slavery. The National Risk Assessment also looked at the number of organised crime groups which are operational in the UK, and importantly identified a number of vulnerabilities in relation to money laundering in the UK. So for example, pure due diligence, the number of products that are available in the financial sector. It looked at the issue of crime enablers, which is becoming more and more important at the moment, lack of transparency and ownership, etc., etc. Some of the key issues around the National Risk Assessment. Number one, it was very unclear in that document how the risks were actually calculated. Risk scores are presented for regulated sector businesses in the UK risk assessment, but it's not clear how the analysis was done around these. And a methodology was used which is referred to as MARIAL, which is a management of risk in law enforcement, which seems to be based largely around a lot of descriptive or qualitative data based on expert evidence from stakeholders to generate the risk scores that appear in that document. So that's unclear. Also as well, there's no talk at all about geographical or territorial level risks of money laundering in the UK risk assessment. So we thought this was possibly a good opportunity to try and build on what was done in the risk assessment a little bit and explore this idea of territory and territorial risks in relation to money laundering. The analysis which is going to be presented in this section, or the work that we've done in IARM, develops a methodological framework for analysing the risk of money laundering. So it's based on what has been largely described by the other two speakers. It's based on this idea of identifying threats and vulnerabilities primarily. The approach that we've taken identifies a number of sources that can populate a methodological framework, and we try and operationalise them as well. However, this is a very difficult thing to do in the UK, and as Mikel is aware, I think for the last 2 years I've been moaning at him about the quality of data in relation to threats and vulnerabilities in the United Kingdom. And I'm not alone in this. A lot of academics and policy people have also been very critical of the paucity of data in the United Kingdom. But what we have done is we've collected data and we've developed an analytical approach which allows for identification of risky territories. What I'm going to present to you today is not me saying these are definitely the most risky sectors and territories in the UK, and this is a composite risk indicator of the risk of those sectors, which has been completely validated. What we are presenting today is a methodological approach which has been based around data, some of which might not be as robust as we would like to have in relation to this. So what are the risk factors? Well, I mean, based on the approach which has been described previously, we look at the threats and vulnerabilities. In the UK, we developed some measures of organised crime threats by looking at organised crime presence across all policing areas in England and Wales. And we developed a measure called organised crime, acquisitive crime rates as well, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. We looked at illicit markets, and we had data here on drug trafficking and drug seizures. And then in relation to vulnerabilities, we had a number of measures in relation to cash intensity of businesses across territories, which is obviously a very good marker or a very good indicator of the risk of money laundering. We looked at the complexity of business ownership, which of course is quite a big issue at the moment. So we looked at beneficial ownership, the distance to beneficial owners, and we looked at shareholding structures as well across UK businesses. We also identified a number of other vulnerabilities which were identified in the literature, and there was also some data available on these. So, for example, data on the real estate, the value of real estate. There has been some literature which has suggested that the value of real estate is linked to money laundering investment, particularly in the City of London and around the London area where real estate values are very high. So we looked at that. We looked at the presence of transit hubs as well. Obviously there's literature which talks around this. You know, where there are transit hubs, there are also risks. Business size and business profitability. So in terms of the operationalisation of our variables, as I've alluded to already, we looked at organised crime, illicit markets. So we developed measures in relation to organised crime, around organised crime groups per million population, where we're very lucky to get some data from the National Crime Agency here, which told us about the groups that are operational and those that were impacting in certain areas. We developed a variable called grouped acquisitive crime per 100,000 population, which was basically based on the idea of identifying which crime types were potentially generating revenues which could be laundered back into the local economy across each area of the UK. So here we included crimes such as distraction burglary, theft of motor vehicle offences, metal theft, transit robbery, plant theft. But what we did, we only included offences where we thought there would be organised crime involvement. So rather than including all distraction burglary, we looked at previous research by Mills et al., which was published in 2013, which looked across a number of crime types and has applied a ratio to those crime types of the proportion that they think is attributable to organised crime. So that was the measure that we used there. We looked at organised crime revenues as a percentage of GDP across local area, and we looked at illicit markets as well. We also gathered data on money laundering offences across England and Wales, but we didn't count this eventually as a threat variable. We use it as a validation measure later on, because money laundering offences are actually not a very good threat indicator of money laundering risk. In terms of vulnerabilities, we had a number of cash intensity measures, complexity of business ownership, and other vulnerabilities as well, as I've already alluded to. Just going to give you a little bit of a feel for some of the data that we collected. I'm just going to pick out a couple of bits and pieces in relation to threats and vulnerabilities. So in relation to threats, what we've got here are two maps, England and Wales. The first one is organised acquisitive crimes, mapped out across England and Wales, and the highest rates per 100,000, unsurprisingly, the City of London, Leicestershire and Nottinghamshire. I don't know if anybody knows these areas, but we think that Leicestershire and Nottinghamshire might come into the mix here a little bit. They're not particularly big urban conurbations, but we think that local police forces are probably quite on the ball in relation to the amount of organised crime that happens in those areas. So it might be inflating the figure a little bit here. In terms of percentages of GDP, the City of London also came out the highest there, probably no surprise. Leicestershire figures again, the Metropolitan Police Area and South Yorkshire, which is quite a big metropolitan area. In terms of vulnerabilities, I think this is probably some of the most interesting data which has come out of our analysis. So we looked at beneficial ownership, and in the UK, beneficial ownership, the average is 1.5, which is obviously a little bit higher than Italy, I do believe. But in terms of looking at area level, the highest is in South Yorkshire, which is nearly 2.5, and Greater Manchester, which is 2. But there are some areas in the UK which have particularly high average beneficial ownership scores. For example, the Channel Islands has 3.7 and the Isle of Man has 3.4. And both of these are offshore little islands in the United Kingdom. So that's quite an interesting finding in itself. Just very quickly, vulnerabilities, connections to risky jurisdictions is also something that we looked at. And the map on the left here is shareholder risk scores. This is related to financial secrecy scores. So this basically tells you where your most risky foreign shareholder populations are. And here we see that the highest risk scores are for London, Sussex and Cambridgeshire. And on the left, this relates to beneficial owner risk scores, where we see that the highest risk locations are Sussex, North Yorkshire and Merseyside. So some interesting sort of analysis of some of the variables there across territorial level. However, one of the problems with all of this is, when you take the threats and vulnerabilities alone, it actually means very little in terms of a risk-based approach. So we took a similar approach to the other researchers in this project, where we did some principal component analysis following exactly the same method that was used previously. So what we did correlation analysis of all the variables that we had. Those that were not significantly correlated, we dropped out of the model. And those where, at the end of the day, where we just couldn't establish what the link was to money laundering risks, we dropped those as well. So, for example, one of the variables that we had was cash machine intensity across local areas. And we ended up dropping that variable because it didn't really seem to be able to explain very much in relation to money laundering. So we did two principal component models. The first model we did was of all police force areas in England and Wales. And this was the findings from that. So we have principal component 1, which explains about 44% of variance in the data that we had. And what comes out here in principal component 1, we have organised crime groups, organised acquisitive crime, which seems to be the main component which is explaining the variation. Principal component 2, I think, is rather interesting. This explains around 18% of the variance in the model. But here we see the emergence of shareholder risk and beneficial owner risk as well as a principal component, which seems to be explaining some of the variation. What was interesting as well in the UK is that the City of London emerges as a clear outlier. I mean, I don't know if many of you are aware of the City of London, but it's a very small area, the financial heartland of London. It has a population of around 8,000 people. And the City of London was coming out on top of everything, of all of the risk indicators. So we took that out and ran the model again, the principal component model, without that area. And what's interesting here is that the variance which is explained in the model is reduced, obviously by taking out the City of London. But the principle, the components that emerge, the first one explains 27% of the variance in the data. And organised acquisitive crime revenues come out here, drug seizures, and transit hubs emerge as well as a key explanatory variable. Principal component 2, again, is rather interesting because this explains around 19% of the variance in the model, but it's this connections to risky shareholders and beneficial owners again, which comes out here as a key principal component. Just very quickly, I'm going to skip over this. We also generated a composite risk indicator, both including the City of London in the analysis and excluding it. And here's the findings from that. The composite risk indicator, including the City of London comes out on top by a country mile. Though if you take the City of London out, it's the Metropolitan Police Area which comes out on top. What is interesting, though, if you compare the two models, there's a Pearson's correlation coefficient of 0.9, which suggests that a lot of areas are ranked very similarly. And if we look at the composite scores, which are ranked across police areas in England and Wales, on the left-hand side here, we have the model including the City of London, where the city obviously comes at the top, Metropolitan Police, Greater Manchester, all big urban conurbations. If you exclude the City of London from the analysis, the Metropolitan Police comes out on top, followed by Greater Manchester. We also have some areas which are included here, which maybe you wouldn't expect to see in relation to money laundering. Number 10 in the model, which includes the City of London, Dyfed Powys is in Wales, which is predominantly a rural area. So I'm not quite sure why this one comes out, but I'll just probably come back to that in a moment. As has been alluded to earlier, one of the beauties of doing these sorts of models is that you can pick out which components are driving the scores across each area. And here's a scatter plot comparing principal component 1 and 2. This excludes the City of London again, because the City of London is an outlier and comes right to the top. And here what we see in the scatter plot is the area which is marked organised crime are those areas where their composite risk indicator seems to be predominantly predicted by the organised crime in their area, or that threat which emerges. Whereas if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, it appears to be risky ownership, which is generating those scores. And as we can see there, Dyfed Powys, which is the Welsh area, which I mentioned earlier, which has a high risk, that seems to be generated by risky business ownership. Now, I'm not quite sure if there's actually something in this, or if there's dodgy data here. I need to look at that a bit more closely. But I think this is rather interesting, and it's an interesting way to look at the data. I'm just going to skip over this one because I've run out of time, and Mikkel is starting to poke me. I'm just going to give some very brief reflections on what we've done. I think there are a number of advantages of adopting this approach. I think there's a lot of potential utility in this approach if it's developed with the appropriate data. As I've said earlier, one of the problems we have in the United Kingdom is the data are really not that good, and this is something that needs to be worked on if we are going to develop this approach. It does apply a risk-based approach, and it does allow us to identify vulnerabilities and threats, which I definitely think is a step forward from what was given in our last national risk assessment. It gives a far better, more structured approach to this. And also business-based models could be developed as well in England and Wales, which I think would be really, really useful. But again, the paucity of data means this is not possible. The issues, well, data limitations, of course. The area model as well, which I've presented, there's kind of an assumption here of spatial linkage between threats and vulnerabilities, that, where you get your threats, your vulnerabilities are somehow linked to this in terms of space, which of course is not always really true in relation to money laundering. And talking to a lot of people in law enforcement recently, one of their big issues is online cybercrime, online laundering, and it's how we kind of factor that into this model also we need to think about. In terms of business models as well, it would be hard to develop business models in terms of the risk heterogeneity which exists within individual business sectors. Businesses are very complex environments. I think accounting for that in these models can be difficult too. And finally, I think there's a question about what all this means in relation to policy and practice. So I've just put here at the bottom, you know, what's the linkage to prevention? And I'm sure a lot of policy people here have kind of got that question on their lips. You know, what do we do with all this information to make it useful from a policy perspective? So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Matt. I think that we have 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So please. Yeah. There is a microphone. Okay. Please present yourself, name, affiliation.
Yes. Hi, Lorenzo Bodrera, investigative journalist of IRPI. It's a Center for Investigative Journalism in Italy. If you could please, any one of you actually, elaborate better. I know the answer. I would give my answer. I would like to hear it from your own points of view and words. The distance between the company and the actual ownership. Could you please elaborate on that in terms of risk assessment? Thank you.
Maybe we can collect other questions in order we can then provide collective answers. Are there any more questions? So we can start answering this and you can think about further queries. I don't know if I can briefly talk, but then I pass the floor. The assumption there is that the higher is the distance between a company and its beneficial owner, the more difficult is to identify beneficial owners, and then the higher is the risk of money laundering. The point, of course, is that if you have a company which is directly controlled by an individual, the individual could be more easily identified. So for customer due diligence, it is easier to identify him. If you have that this beneficial owner is somehow concealed through different layers of other companies intervening in the ownership chain, obviously this makes more difficult, especially if these companies are registered in different countries, because this would imply accessing different business registries, getting ownership data. So we try to measure how much complex is the ownership in each area, in each business sector, in order to see what is the difficulties for a bank, for a professional, or for a financial intelligence unit or law enforcement to identify the beneficial owner. And I think that this is, you know, an innovative approach, but I think that it could be really interesting, especially because now there is this big debate about public registers of beneficial owners. And so this is somehow fits into that debate.
Can I give? Hi. I mean, I'll just give a bit of a UK perspective on this. This has been really big news in the UK, and it's been a real big concern about beneficial ownership. So much so that a new public register is being developed in the UK. And I always think of this issue around beneficial ownership, of how easy it is for somebody to hide their identity and to put themselves at such a distance from the company. It's almost impossible to trace possibly where investments or money are coming from. So I view this as absolutely a key issue in relation to money laundering.
Yeah, please.
Mario Turla, esperto, parlo in italiano, scusatemi. Allora, Mario Turla, esperto in materia di antiriciclaggio. Io volevo fare una domanda, mi è piaciuto molto l'intervento da parte del ricercatore olandese su appunto le attività di riciclaggio che vengono fatte in determinati paesi. Ma vorrei collegarmi con l'intervento, con la domanda che c'era prima. Oltre alla distanza, e noi abbiamo avuto casi in Italia dove a domandare al notaio di chi era la proprietà di determinati edifici, il notaio rispondeva io non lo so e non riesco a saperlo, e la pubblica amministrazione doveva dare l'autorizzazione per la costruzione di un edificio e non poteva impedirglielo perché l'azienda era rappresentata dal legale rappresentante ma non aveva l'obbligo di dire il titolare effettivo, quindi il titolare effettivo non c'era, il notaio non riusciva a capire dov'era e quindi conferma tutta una serie di dati che voi dite del fatto che l'opacità e la semplicità di rendersi opachi e distanziarsi anche da cose molto concrete che sono appunto gli immobili è una cosa molto facile in tutta Europa e soprattutto qua a Milano e in Italia. Ma la mia domanda era, oltre quando è stata attuata la 231 del 2007, introducendo il titolare effettivo nelle istituzioni finanziarie, rendendo obbligatorio dichiarare il titolare effettivo nelle istituzioni finanziarie, si è subito creato un mercato per ristrutturare le aziende per dare questo nome. No? Alcuni studi di professionisti si sono specializzati nel dire così dobbiamo dargli un nome e viene dato il nome. Allora, la mia domanda è vero che il rischio è la distanza, ma è anche vero che il rischio è correlato sicuramente alla qualità del titolare effettivo. Avete provato anche a correlare la capacità del titolare effettivo di avere veramente le competenze per gestire questo tipo di aziende? Grazie.
Thank you for the question. I answer in English. Well, you have all headphones. So.
I didn't get the question,
Yeah,
to be honest.
of course.
My Italian is
No,
not
to
what
make
really
it,
not what
yes,
it could be, I'm
to
afraid.
summarize it, I mean, it was a long question, so I try to make it very brief. Did we look also at the quality of the information on the beneficial owner? So did we look if the beneficial owner at the top of the ownership chain was somehow has the right characteristic to be a beneficial owner or could be a figurehead? Did I understood correctly? Yeah. So, difficult question. Basically, the answer is not, because that would mean that for each company in Italy we analyzed 3.7 million companies. That would mean that for each company we needed to look at the beneficial owner. That was practically impossible. So we just looked at the ownership structure, not yet the identity of the beneficial ownership itself. I think that this could be, an issue for further investigation. So not only how distant is the beneficial owner, but also who is the beneficial owner. Is him or her, 70 years old lady or 18 years old lad owning a company with, a holding company in Luxembourg? So I think that this could be somehow the next step. So looking more micro data on the companies. So there is data to do this, and there is chance, I hope, to improve the investigation in this sense. Yeah.
Yes, perhaps a little bit related to this. So it's a very good question. My Italian is not that, but the translation is very good. So I got most of the answer or of the question. It's important to recognize that legal instruments are there for several reasons, and also in business. Of course, there is distance, and sometimes it's logical, but I wanted to present something about the Netherlands where you have we mentioned this, the BIBOP law, which is a kind of prevention measure, and it can be used by local governments, and that is not, this is related to this, because what the idea is that if people need a license, they really have to provide information, and sometimes they have to show up. And especially this last part, that you have to show up physically, this is really important. So sometimes you have there, in the Amsterdam City Council, a criminal showing up with his nephew, saying, this is the one who needs the license. And this is very physical, and this is also for the government a good sign that this is not the real owner. And so sometimes practical measures also showing up, which is sometimes difficult, and which is also for businesses not, but to have a view on the real reality is also important. And sometimes there are very practical instruments like giving information or asking for information and showing up that also have a preventive effect, that many people think, well, if I have to show up, I won't do that. Or if they show up, that in a local city council, people can see actually who is the one who tries to get a license, although he's trying to hide. So this is something I think is also important.
Related to this, I would have a question, but it's more for probably the next presenters. I mean, is the beneficial ownership registry helping this kind of situation and investigation, in your opinion? Maybe, I don't know if somebody would like to answer now, or we can leave for the next round table. And so, in that case, I invite you to join for a coffee break just outside the room, and we will continue the discussion later with a roundtable in the public sector. Thank you.
Questi sono quelli. Hai l'agenda? E l'agenda? Questi qua sono una fontana, lì, Terbo. Non c'è malato, però c'è Rios.